Good day, everyone! The in-depth discussions of other groups on the three schools of thought within the new institutionalism has presented us how each of these approaches is significantly distinct to comparative political analysis. Each of them has their own view on the nature of the relationship between individual and society, and uniquely analyze how institutions matter. Although these theoretical paradigms are uniquely distinct from each other, we also have to look at their points of concession. Many analysts have exerted their time in trying to combine or synthesize some elements of these thoughts. Hence today, the Group 4 is going to discuss synthesizing theories of institutions and comparative politics. Moving forward, the presented outline will be the sequence of our reporting, following the subtopics and the readings of Barra and Pennington. Further, one of the areas that we can look at for synthesis is between the different ontological viewpoints of rational choice and cultural theory. Hardcore proponents of rational choice theory conform to the assumption that individual actors' choices, interests, and preferences are non-contingent to the social context they are confined in. Hence, many have attacked them for their neglect on the impacts of cultural norms that can also factor people's perceptions towards their interests. Nevertheless, a less rigid rational choice theory can be synthesized with a cultural perspective, and these can be found in the work of Chong in 2002. Chong discussed the importance of political socialization in molding one's identity as long as they are not fully or wholly entrenched or surrounded within their cultural parameters. The convergence tells us that what is important for rational choice theory is to uphold the necessity for individuals to challenge pervasive cultural norms, and through such will they be able to partake in the evolution of new cultural forms. This will be further tackled upon by the next reporter.
Synthesizing culture and rationality. First, let us discuss the view of Harden and Chong in this sentence. Institutions that constitute a sense of cultural identity provides benefits to people who adhere to the rules. According to Harden, the sentence means that the people subscribe to the common norms and values in order to gain access to the material and social benefits associated with the membership of an institution. However, even if the cultural practice may be followed, it will somehow end up to a deliberate choice, or in other words, the rationality of a man will still stand out. Chong added that individuals may consciously shift their cultural practices and subscribe to the new values in order to access benefits. And also, he cited an example for us to understand more about his view. His example is when the immigrants from rural areas adapt to urban mores in order to access employment and other social benefits, which means that people in the rural areas has to go out in their comfort zone to adopt the new environment, which they are not known of. It is evident that the cultural norms of people in the rural areas when coming to urban areas are undergoing a process of adaptation. They are affected by the whole of which they are a part of, but simultaneously involved in the shaping and changing the content of that whole. Next slide, please. Rational choice theory. It is about the accounting for social change. Chong presented a case about social change, in which he made an analysis about the change of attitudes towards racism in the deep American South. Some Southern whites tend to isolate themselves in the community as they oppose racism, while Northern whites who are engaged into business adopted a racist attitude after moving to South to build a good relationship to the locals. Posner similarly cited an example about the accounts for concentration of groups such as gays and ethnic minorities in the metropolitan centers as a reflection of differential incentives to the challenge of norms. According to those views, minor groups doesn't challenge the established practices and tends to escape from the social pressure that they are receiving. They exit from the society that disapprove their behavior and enter to a new relation with another societal group.
So for synthesizing culture and structure. Theoretical synthesis occurs between the cultural analysis and the structural institutionalism. Cultural analysis based on using qualitative research methods. It is the collection of data on cultural phenomena and to interpret cultural representation and practices. In structural institutionalism, it analyzes discourse as knowledge, claims by means of the concept of a constitutive causality, such that the substantive content of ideas provides ideational power and generates immanent change. Antonio Gramsci's Martian analysis on attempting to reassert the role of individual agency and cultural ideas in understanding further the process of social change. Individual agencies on how adept human beings are at evading relevant information. This is done massively by the structure of consciousness itself. Cultural ideas, however, are ideas that individuals have about their culture, including values, belief system, rules, norms, and etc. And these too can conclude to social change in a transformation of cultures, institutions, and functions, and most change isn't instantaneous. He also views the roles of ideas as epiphenomenal to determine the role of economic base. An epiphenomenon is a secondary phenomenon that occurs alongside or in parallel to primary phenomenon. The economic base deals with how a community earns its living. Gramsci also analyzes that orthodox Marxism was incapable of explaining the support for fascism and the apparent diversity of political response to be found across capitalist states.
Greetings everyone, I am Carlo Tarion, and in this report I will be discussing the contribution of Antonio Gramsci. He is a known Italian Marxist and was the founding member of the Italian Communist Party. Being a Marxist, he believed in society being naturally capitalistic in nature and born out of sectoral conflicts about inequality of opportunity and equity between the proletariats and the bourgeoisie. This belief is highly aligned with the Marxian worldview, where proletariats are oppressed by the political elite and conflicts arise because of this continuous exploitation of our middle-class workers. This conflict is highly dependent in the political culture context of the society. This referring to the broad patterns of values present in society that individuals and groups hold towards political practices and objects. In this case, the broad patterns of values are centralized upon the Marxian notion of class struggle, where politics is seen as a struggle for class hegemony and equality, where the ruling class impose certain beliefs on the working class in order to align the others' interests with their own. On structures in the context of politics, these are rules and regulations that exist within society and stipulates their ability to change the rules. Thus, those who are categorized in the weaker variant are those associated with the working class or below the working class, in a sense because of their lack of executive power and access to resources in comparison to the political elite or the bourgeoisie. In the rational choice theory, according to Gramsci, it is the beliefs and values of the individual that dictate as to how structures are changed. Rules are changed by beliefs, especially when mobilizing a high number of individuals. However, despite society having multiple cultural coalitions and allegiances, it remains irrelevant as incentives for their choices at what matters at the end of the day. Nonetheless, these groups are important in the political process as they too participate and have a say in how they are governed.
Good day, everyone. I'm going to talk about the institutionalisms and how these three approaches brought closer together but not completely. Just to further discuss and to understand more these approaches, let us grasp together definitions. Starting with the rational choice institutionalism. It focuses on the purposeful individual, including her motivations and beliefs. Hold fast to methodological individualism, and individuals are assumed as maximizers, who pursue the visible biggest benefits. With that said, political actors are considered self-interested and strategize their actions to maximize their predispositions, which are firm and being shaped in a solitary state of institutional context. Next is cultural institutionalism. It firstly believes that individuals always make decisions in a way that it gives consideration to the predominant ideas and beliefs that are broadly shared by members of the communities. It does not require individuals necessarily be on the same wavelength with all the ideas and beliefs, but that action is informed by reference to a set of common practice and norms. Institutions influence behavior and action not only by characterizing what you do in a role or situation, but also by characterizing what one can think of in that particular context. In other words, the manner in which individuals make their decision is affected by the context of their cultural norms. And then lastly is structural institutionalism. It believes that institutions and social structures practice power in their own right with both individual interests and the meanings that individuals set down to institutions being mostly the product of their place in the top of institutional structure where society is concerned. Political actors are considered as simply providers of political role and beliefs in a system or society that functions on the authority of law and logic. Also, institutional structures have two vital roles, which are to determine the content of people's interest and belief and governed by different laws of motion. So, since the definition of these approaches have already been discussed, in summary, structures mainly play as a set of rules that govern the relations between actors. For rational choice theorists, much as culture and institutional structures may exert influence on individual action in the final analysis, it is still the incentives and beliefs of the individuals that create the explanation of how social structures are being aware of. In the view of cultural institutionalism, common interests are being shared by the individuals with other people originated from cultural allegiance or a structural position in a society. Above all, they might have different rules as to their own approaches, but they all focus on institutions and studies using comparative method or analysis which influences change.
These theories might have explained well already by other groups, so let us have a brief review on why institution matters. First is the rational choice institutionalism. In this, institution matters because different institutions affect the pattern of costs and benefits that face individual political actors. According to this view, individuals always make their choices in the same way, that is, they act as the maximizers of benefits over cost, but the outcomes of these choices will be affected by the institutions that are present. According to Adam Smith, if institutions are properly or appropriately structured, the pursuit of self-interest by actors within society can lead to beneficial social results, even if those results are not the specific intents of the actors concerned. Smith also focused on the crucial role of institutional context, particularly in the existence of private property and competitive markets as critical factors in determining better results. Second is the cultural institutionalism. Simply in this theory, institution matters as they believe that institutional practices, whether of the hard or soft variety, are the embodiment of cultural values and beliefs. Hard institutions such as parliaments and courts, and soft institutions such as dress codes and modes of speech like accents, are basically reflections of historically shared legacies and experiences, which people define as part of their way of life or who they are, or like in general what their identity is. Therefore, what it means to call oneself a British or Filipino, working class or middle class, is a reflection of shared experiences and meanings that have been forged through a particular set of historical events. Lastly, or third, structural institutionalism. Institutions matter to the proponents of this theory because it is the institutions that determine the interests and beliefs of different social actors. Basically, individual agents and even as large as states do not choose the social arrangements within which they operate, and neither such arrangements are the product of historical accidents. Instead, institutions have a purpose of their own, and it is in these system requirements that determine the course of political events. Therefore, structuralist theories pay relatively little attention to the micro details of the political process and concern themselves with a larger macrostructure such as the international economy, nation-state, and capitalism. Next slide, please. Synthesizing theories of institutions and why institutions matter. When we try to understand why institutions matter, theoretical similarities between a weaker variant of rational choice theory and cultural perspective become evident because the issue here is the significance of cultural institutions and how they enable actors to cope with conditions of complexity as what Herbert Simon coined bounded rationality. According to Simon, or to this bounded rationality, individuals cannot always base their decisions on the cool computation of benefits over cost. The human brain is fundamentally limited in its capacity to process information and to make computations and must therefore resort to habits, traditions, and rules of thumb. In a sense, making use of tradition provides regularity in people's lives, and while leading to optimal or perfectly efficient results, enables effective behavior by reducing the amount of information that must be processed. Therefore, the cultural conventions and belief systems that form the core of cultural analysis are compatible with the weaker strain of rational choice. On the other hand, traditional rules can act as an essential memory aid, making it easier to those or for those who follow them to achieve their objectives under complex conditions. Rule-guided or habitual action is still a resolute action, thus compatible with a rational choice approach, which recognizes imperfect information and the need for actors to adapt strategies to deal with such conditions, wherein many political institutions can be analyzed in these terms. An example of that is the constitutional traditions of monarchy.
Making choices about behavior. Rational choice. According to the rational calculation of advantage, there is a common mistake to both hardcore rational choice theories and of some cultural theorists to suggest that methodological individualism implies that all actors make their decisions in precisely the same way. However, when we talk about methodological individualism, talks about individuals' behaviors must explain social phenomena in making choices and interacting with other individuals. This means that individuals have their own way of making decisions and they are more self-reliant. However, a commitment to methodological individualism would not explain how individuals make decisions. Individuals can be perfectly rational, strictly rational, regular rulers, or even automatons. All that matters to the methodological individualist is that people make choices in every way, and not cultures or structures. From the viewpoint of strong rational choice theorists, attention to propensities and custom disregards individuals' overall responsiveness to motivations and relative cost. It is to be dismissed definitely due to the emphasis of group-level factors. For example, culture. This means that they do not care much about decision-making outcomes, but they just do what they are used to. For some cultural theorists, looking at this part of culture, there is a recognition that actors settle on choices in ways other than cool computation of advantages over expenses is to yield the situation for some type of methodological holism, and is to be welcome all things considered. When talking about holism, it is an approach to considering human minds and action that relies on looking at life as a whole. People also adapt rule-following strategies does not really does not necessarily take away the principle of methodological individualism, but they just tend to look at things as a whole.
So, what is the concept of path dependency? Path dependency, the tendency of institution or technology to become committed to develop certain ways as a result of their structural properties or their beliefs and values, and often used in studies based on the historical institutionalist approach and based on straightforward assumption that history matter. It attempts to explain the exactly how history matters through studies of the means by which constraints on the normal behavior appears and the form of those constraints take, and it focuses on how institutions come to constraints or organizational life. So this to describe path dependency is when the decisions presented to people are dependent on the previous decisions or experience made in the past. So path dependence exists when a feature of the economy, institution, technical standard, pattern of economic development, and etc. It is not based on current condition, but rather has been formed by a sequence of past action, each leading to distinct outcome.
Cultural rational approaches using path dependency. So, what is rational choice and cultural analysis? To understand culture not as a set of individual propensities, but as a coordinator of strategies and expectation among independent but mutually reliant actors. As a social institution to language and offer a coherent explanation of what sustains and also of what can change. Culture, even among fully socialized. Cultural and rational choice analyses have long been seen as an antithetical approaches based on diametrically opposed views of human nature and theory construction.
So good day everyone. For synthesis but not integration, our main focus here is on how we synthesize. And just to give you a recap of what was discussed a while ago, in synthesizing, we need to identify or to put in mind that institutions matter, and second is the fruitful area of synthesis between different ontological viewpoints, that between rational choice and cultural theory. So both of these are important when synthesizing because of their different ontological viewpoint. So on synthesizing, it is important to first identify or highlight the central points in order for us to determine the central focus of the topic. It is also important for us to know what is the mean for it of what we synthesize and to have an idea or an overlook of our topic. Another point to remember when synthesizing is to preclude the existence of a fully integrated approach. So why is it important? It is essential because we need to have an assessment or an integrated approach requires an acknowledgement between linkages of the main point and its primary aim to optimize its risks in order to prevent losses. So the fundamental issues in the synthesis are the following: the nature of how people make their decision, and second is a product, particular cultural and structural institutional forms. So for number one, the nature of how people make their decision. Decision making is important because it is quite hard in determining people because of our differences and our own interests, or on how we pursue our interests and their decision, aside from basing them to their experiences, they have their own values on making their wise choices. That's why the nature of how people make their situation, is a fundamental issue when synthesizing. Second is the product particular cultural and structural institutional forms. So social and cultural aspect of a society forms its very nature. This is particular when the product or service is cultural bound, attempt to explain such matter as integration and trends in inequality. It is sometimes defined simply as patterned social relations, those regular and repetitive aspect of the interactions between the members of a given social entity. Even on this descriptive level, the concept is highly abstract. It selects only certain elements from ongoing social activities. According to Karl Polanyi, the theories in both culturalist and structuralist comes the model of economizing behavior, depicted by rational choice theories and is limited to the cultural and structural context of the modern market. Universal characteristic of human action is a product of a very specific set of cultural and institutional practices. So for rational choice theories, on the statement of Karl Polanyi, we can dissect it into two parts. So first is scarcity is a fundamental aspect on the human existence, and second is the people will respond to incentive irrespectively. So to attempt it attempts to apply microeconomics model of rationality to the analysis of the collective choices that are made in the political process. His central focus is a purposeful individual and their motivations and belief. As such, rational choice theory adhered to the principle of methodological individualism from a rational choice perspective. Individuals always make deliberate and conscious choice in pursuit of their personal goals, even when action takes place in a collective setting, such as interest group, or the state. The individual actor must always be the focus of concern. So for the different institutional structures and the incentives that people face. So first is the cultural values incentive made across society. And second is the cultural and institutions condition the parameter and determine the existence or non-existence of rational self-interested action. So for the number one, the cultural values incentive made across society. Through differences across societies or between societies, value of each culture or diversity may vary. That's why there are no assurance that one society have the same cultural values or incentives. Second is the cultural institutions condition the parameter and determine the existence or non-existence of rational self-interested action. So social institutions are mechanisms or patterns of social order focused on meeting social needs such as government, economy, education, family, healthcare, religion, and some sociological methods that focuses on examining social institutions over time or compare them to social institutions in other parts of the world.
The origin of institutions and institutional change. Onto the question of how and why particular institutions exist, there are fairly discernible theoretical overlaps that are present. The most noticeable of it is the rational structural approaches and the overlap between the strong version of the rational choice theory and structural Marxism, given that we should ignore the individualistic base of the former and the holistic structuralism of the other. For the hardcore rational choice theorists, institutions arise and are chosen depending on their efficiency enhancing properties. Given this perspective and assuming that individuals are rational utility maximizers, they would therefore opt to choose institutional forms that give emphasis on the individual and social utility. This therefore establishes that institutions are efficient, and should they not function as such, they would be replaced accordingly. With this lens, the process of institutional change is driven by shifts in technologies and relative prices. thus making individual actors respond by adapting political institutions to maintain efficiency. Given that this focuses on the responses of utility maximizing agents, the parallels with structural Marxism are nonetheless clear. In Marxist accounts, it is the underlying nature of the economic base that determines the institutions of society at any given time and which drives the process of institutional change. In this view, developments in technology, to use Marxist terminology, will bring about changes in the institutional rules of society. If there are structural tensions between given set of forces of production and the failing relations of production, then some form of societal revolution will be necessary to bring social structures back to line. The implication of strong rational choice and structural Marxism is that social institutions have a tendency to approach optimality. Either they represent an efficient response to the utility maximizing behavior in individuals, or they are seen to fulfill a necessary role commensurate with the particular historical stage in societal development. As such, both these schools allow little, if any, room for the role of ideas and the possibility of human error in understanding the process of institutional development. The assumption of people or structural forces know what the optimal set of societal arrangements actually is the basis of this type of approach.
In light with what was discussed by Mr. Tadike, there is again considerable scope for theoretical synthesis between the weaker version or the soft rational choice theory and a cultural perspective. So this approach may in turn find some affinity with a non-Martian form of structural institutionalism. Okay, so from a cultural institutionalist perspective, many political practices and institutions evolve in a similar way and are, to a significant degree, the legacy of historical accidents. In other words, the prevailing institutional practices may owe their origins to a combination of historical accidents and misguided attempts at deliberate institutional design. Now, the weak version of rational choice theory allow greater scope for the role of ideas in the process of institutional choice. So these are the ideas are seen to influence the institutional context of decision making, and owing to errors in institutional design that may lead to the creation of deficient incentive structure. So the inefficient institution persists according to the incentive structure present that originated to historical accidents. So that is the point where cultural perspective and the soft rational choice perspective meet. Now, this rational cultural approach focuses on the relationship between ideas, the structural rules that these ideas help to create or set up, and the incentive or lack of incentives to change the relevant institutional structures should they turn out to contain errors and inefficiencies. Well, that ends the presentation of Group 4 on synthesizing theories of institutions in comparative politics. Thank you so much for listening.